I wanted to welcome all of you, friends, people who are connected to this church, people in the community, to what I'm calling my first installment of At the Foot of the Cross. It won't be my last installment, but I wanted to at least post this and see what kind of response there is from people who might watch it. I have been thinking, as many of you have over these days, about the whole idea of isolation. And I've been thinking about isolation and how interesting it is in terms of timing that we are being asked to isolate during the season of Lent. It makes me think about the isolation that Jesus went through at the end of his own life on his way to Jerusalem and the cross. That isolation in many ways started back at the Last Supper when Jesus identified the fact that somebody was going to betray him and somebody was going to deny him, and despite the fact that Jesus was sharing that meal with his friends, that isolation probably started in many ways during that last meal that Jesus ate. And then the isolation continued as they made their way to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus and the disciples, and Jesus fervently hoped that his friends would stay awake with him during that time of waiting, Jesus knowing what was going to happen to him. And yet the disciples fell asleep, so Jesus went off and prayed by himself. More isolation in the Garden of Gethsemane. And not long after that, Jesus was arrested by the Roman soldiers, and he was isolated away from his friends and his community, and he stood before Pilate to face the accusations that he was the Son of God. More isolation. And then finally, the ultimate isolation, Jesus being on the cross all by himself. Yes, there were thieves on either side of him, and there were women who stood at the foot of the cross, and Roman guards who were nearby, but the experience of being isolated was something that is really hard for any people to imagine. But that isolation was so real for Jesus, and maybe that's a way in which we can, as all of us are isolating during this season of Lent, maybe we can understand some of the isolation that Jesus went through way back during the time of his final days leading up to his crucifixion. So I think there are maybe two messages to be drawn from during this season. The first message is, if Jesus can endure the isolation he endured on the way to the cross, all of us can surely endure the isolation that we are going through over these next few weeks. And I think there's something powerful about that, Jesus setting an example for us, an example of perseverance, even in the midst of the struggle and the fear and the anxiety that was swirling around him. But even more than that message of, if Jesus can do it, so can we, I think there's a really important message about what to do during a time of isolation. The one thing that Jesus did time and time again, even when he was off by himself and isolated from other people, he turned to God and he asked God in prayer and in conversation to be with him. And I think that's one thing that all of us can do during this time too, as we are feeling isolated and as we are removing ourselves from public places and from the community of friends who surround us all the time. God never isolates from us. God is always there for us. So we can use this time during Lent to remember that even when we are lonely and all by ourselves, there's no such thing as being disconnected from God. God is always there for us to turn to. So Jesus modeled for us not only how to endure isolation, but how to turn to God when we feel isolated and when we are isolated. And I hope that's an important message that we can take with us during this season of Lent, especially during these next weeks as we go through our own isolation. Blessings to all of you, and stay tuned for more tapings at the foot of the cross here at Wapping Community Church.